Welcome in, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are at the Design Workshop for Open Source Plugin Garage ADU Solution. My name is Fernanda, and I'm the Membership and Fundraising Associate at the Housing Leadership Council. I want to share my appreciation for City Systems and all the attendees that are making this event possible. Now more than ever, we must respond to the housing shortage and make San Mateo County a more equitable and affordable place. If you already aren't a member of HLC, please consider becoming one and give for those who can. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Design Workshop for Open Source Plugin Garage ADU Solution, hosted by Derek of City Systems. If you have any questions or issues with Zoom, please drop them in the chat or raise your hand, and an HLC staff member will help you out.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. And thanks to HLC for hosting this. I think this will be a pretty unique experience for those of us who have attended many HLC events in the past. I'm not sure if there's been a design workshop like this. So I hope this will be a exciting and refreshing and stimulating experience for everyone here. I have some names I recognize, folks I've worked with in the past in the group, but also some new names. This group, I think, is big enough that we won't have the time to go through individual introductions. So the flow of the next hour or hour and a half, depending on how much feedback there is I'll share what a duo is and what the design is, and that will include some interactive demos on a design tool. And I think I'll want to go through that in one fell swoop to make sure that those who merely want to get that content and not necessarily participate in extended Q&A and feedback can kind of see that and then can hop off as soon as you'd like to. But then please be taking notes and dropping questions and comments into the chat throughout that whole time. And then I think we'll go naturally into some discussion at the end of the presentation, and we can then jump back to previous slides or specific parts of the design model. And hopefully that will just flow naturally until we feel like there's been a good amount of learning in all directions. Okay. This will also be recorded. This is partially for my benefit, so I can stay as engaged as possible in discussion without having to take notes myself. And it's possible that some of this content might get used for certain kinds of videos we want to put out about the Duo initiative. But if so, it would not be in its entirety. And I would reach out if there were any specific comments you had made that I wanted to feature in any future storytelling about this project. So otherwise, think of this as really just so that others who weren't able to make this event but wanted to could rewatch the recording, and for my own note-taking afterwards. Okay. So a little bit about myself. My name is Derek. I wear a lot of different hats, and some of you have engaged with me in very different contexts. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford, I studied architecture and civil engineering, and then I went on to a structural engineering master's degree. So my background is all in building systems and design. And in 2013, Stanford had actually participated in this international design competition hosted by the Department of Energy. It's called the Solar Decathlon. And over the course of 2 years, we were designing and then building an actual 1,000 square foot net zero solar powered house. It was built on Stanford campus, and then it was built modular so that we took it apart, put it on 50-foot trucks, and took it all the way down the 5 freeway to Orange County, put it back together in 7 days, and had a big competition with 19 other colleges. So you can imagine that was a huge learning experience for myself and many of my classmates. And it definitely got me into and excited about high performance building systems in industrialized construction, a few very specific interesting energy systems. And as you can see on the top left image here and the right top image, there was this concept of what we call the core, which was to have, I think any designer in the house will see this as basically a no-brainer concept of keeping your plumbing systems as compact as possible, basically having a bathroom and kitchen wall assembly. But we as students wanted to really brand our concept as the home of the future would have this be this engineered module that would be mass manufactured, but would allow for customizability of the rest of the single family home. So that was the story we told primarily as a university in that competition. And a lot of that core concept, while none of us went forth and really built a full business around that, has stayed with me as I've thought about multifamily, as I've thought about developing world contexts, and then we'll come back around to how I've then kind of reconsidered it for ADUs. But this shows just some of my technical background and the kind of construction work that I'm familiar with. Now, since then, my main job is actually teaching at Stanford now. I do teaching of data science. We do research projects. We've done a lot of COVID response over the last year or so. My interests have definitely ranged more to the urban planning scale social problem solving in general. But I've also founded a nonprofit since then called City Systems. And that was partially with the goal of just bringing more students into the kind of social change work I was interested in. That could be primarily very data driven, but would build on that systems perspective that I've been developing in curricula at Stanford. But then naturally, we started to get interested in affordable housing issues. I got connected to local cities, counties, community-based organizations, and came across ADUs as an important context, particularly in East Palo Alto, where there in 2016 or so was a big incident of lots of red tags of unpermitted ADUs, mostly garage conversions. And so seeing that first as just a situation that needed to be thought of from a systems perspective, we jumped in to assist other nonprofits like Rebuilding Together Peninsula, EPA Can Do, and SOUP, who are already deeply engaged in the community, to offer some of our services. And that looked like directly helping with some legalizations of unpermitted units. That was in the context of a larger community-based effort. That was funded by Facebook. So we basically were able to take 2 or 3 of these properties and see them from an unpermitted state to a legalized state. That taught me, of course, something that will be relevant to what a duo is, but we're not all necessarily ADU projects. We learned a lot about the various kinds of barriers. And I think the most heartbreaking thing to me at that point was that most homeowners who had done unpermitted units in East Palo Alto did not have the capacity, money, or time to actually take it to legalization. I mean, we were able to do it for some projects that had grant money, but the vast majority of homeowners just had to demolish back to a garage state, to a non-habitable state, and they didn't have the money to go through the full ADU legalization or new ADU process. So I came away from that experience seeing lots of barriers, but fundamentally seeing the cost barrier as well, because many homeowners had the resources of knowledge and the folks who would guide, but we just didn't have the money to get these projects done. Anyway, this experience of legalizing garage conversions definitely embedded me in the community. We did a lot of community outreach, and that kind of transformed into some non-design projects I've done in the ADU space since then. So in the top left is a diagram that ended up being part of the final task force report in East Palo Alto. I'll start to drop some links if it's interesting to folks. That document does give a sense of that bigger picture beyond just questions of architecture and engineering that we saw when it comes to second units and displacement in East Palo Alto. So that was a very community-oriented process. Right next to that on the right, you can see a little fee calculator we built. So some of the barriers are just how do you plan effectively for those permitting kinds of costs. So we've built that in different languages. The bottom left, you can see a pre-Symbian look up your address tool that we had built when it was still very difficult for individual homeowners to know what they were eligible for before and after state law. So we've been doing that for a while. Right next to that on the bottom right in the middle, you can see a general tool that we built for San Mateo County to think about targeting ADU outreach based on ADU permits, as well as a lot of different census characteristics. So that brings in some of our geospatial and census kinds of analyses. And then the last 2 images on the right are upcoming projects for the Casita Coalition. On the top right, we built a kind of wiki to make it really easy to search for code that's relevant to ADUs, as well as HCD interpretations that have come in since then. And I can imagine a lot of you have been through the same process as me, where you have this kind of gray area question and you need to go search up what the official response has been. So that tool will be out soon for Casita Coalition members. And then hopefully next year as well, you can see on the bottom right, we're starting to build a statewide gallery of ADU projects that will make it easy for anybody to just kind of get a sense of who's out there doing work and has done good ADUs. So that's a sense of the big picture, right? And I didn't necessarily think I was going to go back into actually delivering ADUs on a project by project basis. I've been increasingly more interested in the system scale, data-driven solutions, policy-oriented solutions. But then a philanthropist came knocking on my own door. And some of you might have been aware of this, but that there was a Facebook Housing Innovation Fund administered by Philanthropic Ventures Foundation. And they had done some deep research in the community and then had reached out and invited specific nonprofits to apply. And given that kind of open opportunity, then I did kind of go back on and pick up something off the shelf, which was this idea of the core, which we had done in that 2013 single family home, and then started to wonder, hey, could that be, can I connect the dot between that and garage conversions? Of course, this could also work in the backyard, but the typical detached ADU is small enough to be in its entirety a modular unit. And I've seen plenty of companies already putting out products in that space. but this idea of getting a little bit more to the component level was intriguing, and it sort of just posed the question to the funders, what if we could come up with this idea, have it actually be useful? Of course, that's a big question. And then once it's done, since I may not be particularly in interest or have the bandwidth to make that my full-time entrepreneurial venture, then that would just be put out into the world as a kind of quote unquote public good. So however that lands for you guys, at least from the funders' perspective, they wanted to fund it. So that's why City Systems is one of the grantees, along with a few other local organizations, as you can see in the diagram on the right. And that kicked off really from around April of this year. What we've been doing since then has been the first phase of developing the duo design. And we've found two homeowners, one in East Palo Alto and one in North Fair Oaks, who are in the building permit process right now with basically the design you'll see. There's still some time to shape it, so that's why I'm very interested in the feedback you'll share today. And then, of course, your feedback would affect just what the final design is for future recipients. And the goal is by the end of 2022 to have those projects done, to have told a really multimedia, high quality story around the design and construction, and to put all that information, including the drawings and design details, online to then make that a kind of repository for this method. And as we'll get into, the hope is that individual designers, manufacturers, and contractors can pick up the basic interoperable system that I'll be showing, and just allow for really opening the door to a lower cost kind of ADU option that maybe just hasn't quite been out there in the world. Again, those are conjectures that have started this process. And part of the feedback I'll be interested in is if you guys buy that, if that seems like we're hitting the right target here, if there will be any demand for this from your perspective, and what we can do to maybe shape that impact even more. So that was some of the background. Again, if you've got comments and questions throughout, feel free to just keep them in mind for later or drop questions in the chat and we'll be able to revisit as we go. So the fundamental goals of a duo, and a duo is just our brand name. It doesn't mean anything else. We basically said, if this is going to be useful, it needs to be at least less than $100,000 because that's the socioeconomic, population that we had spent a lot of time engaging with in East Palo Alto, and they weren't able to conceive of ADU projects that were more expensive than this. And this number is meant to be, all costs combined. So once you factor in permitting fees and so forth, then what I am claiming here is that materials and labor cost of the actual architecture and engineering construction can be more in the 75,000 or less range to give that buffer. So I think that is, of course, doable, but at scale and in all kinds of situations is an open question of whether we can design something that actually delivers at this cost. The next aspect of the original goal here was to make it open source. And like I said before, this is partially just because I personally don't think I'm not at the point in my career or philosophy to want to go into a for-profit enterprise. I do wonder to what degree turning this into a for-profit venture can limit its affordability and its scale of interoperability. And part of what I'm interested in is a related goal of encouraging the local economy, so that the small scale kinds of contractors and potential manufacturers can get involved in this. Job training programs can get involved in building some of these components. So that's a certain philosophy, of course, but to the degree that that also can just lower the bar when it comes to the cost, I felt like that was important to be paired with the first goal. You can see on the bottom right is an image of a Creative Commons license that I've been thinking about for this material. Once it's on the web, it allows for commercial use, so people can make money off of this design, but it just always gets reattributed back to the original design. So that's what I've been thinking about so far. And then another goal from a pure design perspective and user perspective is wheelchair accessibility. My sense from having engaged with families in East Palo Alto and North Fair Oaks is that a lot of the first interest is not for this to be rented out to tenants, but to deal with an existing overcrowding situation and maybe an aging household member. So basically the two projects we're currently doing are both for the mom in the family, the grandma in the family. And that seems to, that may open up the question to what degree this type of ADU is actually true housing production or is more indirect. But in any case, it seems to be valuable from a design perspective to try to make these solutions wheelchair accessible. And that gets practically to questions of, you can think of modules as being raised floor or not, and you'll see how we came to certain solutions around that. Okay. So the kind of feedback that I'd be interested in and find valuable for now includes a subset of all possible kinds of feedback. So let me just put some, I think, common sense suggestions out. If you've heard what I've pitched so far and your first response is this will never work, this is fundamentally opposed to how I think about ADU markets and so forth, I will definitely want to hear that feedback and talk through it. But maybe it's best to save that until after this meeting, because that might kind of disincentivize others who are bought into the concept from providing useful feedback. So if you're incredibly negative at any point, then I definitely want to engage, but maybe not in a public setting like this. On the other end of that spectrum, if you're totally bought in and you have very in the weeds kinds of design details, you start to see the SketchUp model I'll show and you're saying, oh, it's missing baseboards and so forth. There's a certain level we haven't detailed yet in our design drawings and models. And that's part because it's at the schematic level still. So I'll definitely be interested in that most in the weeds construction assembly question and suggestion you might have, but that also probably should be saved for after. So I think the kind of feedback that would be the most enriching for all of us in the group setting would be if you have high-level missed opportunities you're spotting in the intent and the method here, as well as just the big challenges that might be our blind spots. Definitely want to hear those. At some moderate level of design and construction related questions, flaws you see in the reasoning, and issues that might come up, would love to hear those as well. And then if you've just have some instructive example from your own experience of having been an ADU recipient or builder or designer, on the other side of the counter, would love to bring in that anecdotal experience as well. Okay, so some of you might have seen this GIF that was on aduo.org. So here's roughly the concept, again, in sequence form, and then we'll get really into details with the interactive model. So typical garage is 1 car or 2 car, and I think this primarily is best for a 2-car garage, but could be for a 1-car garage as well. But you've got some existing state, and the idea is that you would first prepare a quote unquote blank canvas in the garage, and that can include solving a lot of the problems that do make garage conversions difficult, where you've got to kind of figure out whether the existing structure is okay, whether the interiors of the walls have insulation or not, etc. So the first step is to kind of gut the existing garage, and then there's the opportunity if you needed more window glazing, natural ventilation availability, you can add windows here, and that either will require structural engineering or not at that stage. Then you would add insulation and also fire and sound rating on walls that are up against the main residence. And then you would get pretty much to a finished state. So I would imagine at this stage of an aduo process, you walk into your garage and a lot of walls have drywall at that point. And it, many pieces look pretty much ready to go, and you're then thinking, how do I place these Lego components in that are then the major bathroom plumbing and kitchen plumbing aspects at the core. So then we have 4 different configurations at this point. We'll be able to look at one of them in particular in more detail later. But the configurations are 2 kinds of bathrooms and 2 kinds of kitchens, and just all the different combinations. You can see it's getting placed in the back corner of this example, and it just so happens to work well with where the windows are placed. That's another question of, how do you deal with existing window situations? But we try to imagine that in any garage, you can point at some back or left corner and imagine putting a bathroom in the back corner. So that's roughly what this is. So you can see the bathroom in the back, it has a standing, a tub shower, and then the kitchen on the front is an L-shaped kitchen. But then the kitchen can be swapped from an L shape to an I shape. And then the bathroom can swap from a tub shower to a 3x3 transfer shower, which makes for an even more compact plumbing arrangement, as well as just a smaller amount of material in general. And then that version as well can be transfer shower plus this L-shaped kitchen. And this ended up being, of the 4, when we presented it to homeowners, the ones that were most exciting to them all. So you'll see a model and design drawings that look like this one. Okay. So we'll get much more into the step-by-step components as well. So we'll get there. And then there almost certainly would need to be some separation, at least from an odor perspective, between the bathroom space and the rest of the space. So that can be a lower ceiling than the actual garage ceiling, or you can kind of fill the walls up to the existing garage ceiling. The rest of the space can be studio arrangement, in which our proposal to keep costs low is to just put no other interior partition walls. But then you can imagine if the garage is big enough and the user is comfortable enough with fairly small spaces, then you can separate between the dining space and the bathroom space, and you can even have other kinds of separations as you'd like. But for both homeowners that we're working with, they're perfectly content with just the studio arrangement. So then the bedroom could just kind of be in the opposite corner from the bathroom. And then you can see the last step would be, because you had been moving all this stuff in via the open garage door area, to replace that with an infill with a concrete curb. And that's basically it. So the conjecture is, if you simplified the steps to this and you had an easy way to purchase components, you had contractors who knew what to do, and we work out a few other kinks in the process, does this basically make garage conversion go from a difficult concept to something that feels attainable for the average homeowner, especially low-income homeowners. So that's the real focus, of course. This is not trying to be high-end. This is not trying to necessarily compete with detached ADUs if a homeowner wanted a detached ADU. This is really about maximizing the value contained in the garage that may not be used for vehicles anymore and may have a lot of structure that can be repurposed and can reduce the cost as a result. Okay. So to get to a sense of, if you feel like a lot of what we've solved here may seem trivial, I wanted to jump on, I think, things that are novel that we felt were important design challenges, and we think we have interesting solutions. So this will be some of the detail that might be the most interesting to many folks in the room that do a lot of construction and design. So one is fire and sound rated barriers, because this is the type of ADU that will have a separating shared wall between two quote unquote separate dwelling units. And so those who are familiar with this know that looks like a 1 hour fire rating. That also looks like a sound transmission class of 50. And it's just helpful to kind of think through, what's the most cost effective and straightforward way to do that. And we think we have a solution there. Wheelchair accessible design, I've already mentioned before. And then when it comes to just our attempt to do any of this in a factory setting, as opposed to just coming up with a design that could be stick built interior, the reasons that would be helpful would be that it actually saves time and money. And then the constraints you have to then work with for going the prefab route is that it needs to be easy to deliver and install, and it needs to not reduce the freedom and flexibility that homeowners want with their different layout desires and the existing layouts of the garage. So those are problems to have to solve from our perspective if we're going prefab at all. Then there's a challenge we've spent a lot of time thinking about if you want to stick with the floor level of the existing garage. So imagine concrete slab, and you're going to put a bathroom in there. So the biggest question is subfloor plumbing and how that ultimately connects to a lateral. And how do you do that in a way that works with objects that have above floor plumbing coming at a separate time in the process. So there's a pure question of how do you connect lines successfully and deal with inspection and so forth. So we have a way of thinking about that we'll share. And then maybe a more minor one, but I wanted to include it in this list, is the average on-grade slab has a slight slope to it to let moisture and water drain out. So how do you practically solve that? In all of these cases, you'll see how far we've thought about it so far if we think we have a solution, but would love to hear if other folks have good solutions for these kinds of challenges. Another way to solve for an unlevel concrete floor is to just go for a raised floor design, which is another possible component in this larger Aduo system that we might discover we need to do more often because of that challenge I've described. Okay. So let me start with 2 more slides that get at the first 2 challenges here, and then I'm going to switch to a screen on SketchUp so we can get into looking more at the design itself, which will then help us cover some of the other design challenges. So one of the collaborators we have who was involved in the solar decathlon competition back in 2013, his day job is doing facilities at Stanford, lab facilities, office settings. So he brought up a suggestion for a shaft wall assembly, which is more common in commercial settings. You can see the UGS detail on the bottom, it's UL design, and it is a specific kind of metal stud track system. And then you place a potential sound barrier in between, and then you can still do sheetrock X rating on the outside. And this allows you to kind of implement fire rating from just one side of a setting. So you can keep an existing wall in place and then just put the shaft wall on a face of it, and you can do this on the ceiling as well. I'd be curious if folks have experience with shaft wall systems or and have maybe a strong criticism of using this in a residential setting. But this seemed like it potentially suffices. And at least in one attempt so far to use that detail in a drawing for East Palo Alto, it's gotten through the building review. So as a generic solution for a wall that's shared between a garage and a main residence, it seems like this is a possible solution. Maybe not the cheapest, maybe not the easiest, but that's what we are proposing at the moment. And we'll try it out with our 2 demonstration projects. It is definitely fire rated. The sound transmission class, we were wondering whether that would pass the snuff test because it alone is only 39. But then we claimed basically that a combination of this with additional sound insulation barrier inside and the fact that you still have a 2x6 wall that is the existing wall, then the combined sound class rating must be over 50. And that seemed to pass the sniff test from building review. Okay, so that's one of our design level solutions for the separation walls and or ceilings with the rest of the residents. There's a video if you're curious to look more at the shaft wall system. Okay, the bathroom is something we don't think we have a perfect solution for. So I'm calling this an almost ADA compliant bathroom plan. And remember, part of our goal was we need a small bathroom. So the immediate thing that happens as soon as you start to design an ADA compliant bathroom is you need bigger bathrooms. So we really flipped that question around and said, just what in theory is the absolute smallest ADA compliant bathroom you could design? The main clearance problems you need to solve for, if you're familiar with this, are a specific relationship for a wheelchair to navigate into a transfer shower or a tub shower. And in the transfer shower case, that basically requires 6 feet of width no matter what, because you need a kind of right turn or left turn with 3 feet of clearance. So that already sets a 6 foot minimum width for whatever bathroom you design. And most ADA bathrooms are quite a bit wider than that. Then there's a turning circle or T that you can incorporate, and you have abilities to deal with toe and knee clearance as well. And you can see here that it is possible in this arrangement to then put a sink next to the shower and then put a toilet next to the sink and have this turning T without having to increase that width anymore. But then the placement of that turning T, as well as the minimum grab bar dimensions for a toilet in the corner, then generate this 9'5" length. So this is, I think, conclusively the bare minimum size of an ADA compliant residential bathroom, except for the asterisk I have here, which is related to the sidebar for a toilet, which in all documentation I've seen is a continuous amount of sidebar that's at least 42 inches, and that needs to extend at least 44 inches away from the sidewall. And that's not possible because we need a way out of this bathroom, which is the door. So you'll see in the 3D model that our hacky solution will be to have a door assembly that has a part of this 42-inch sidebar, but that introduces a potential area of this continuous grab bar, and that grab bar may sometimes not be there when the door is open. Now, from a user perspective, the average user might look at this and say, this is totally sufficient from a use case when it comes to having grab bars where I need them to be able to navigate on and off the toilet. From an ADA compliance perspective, we have no idea yet whether this will pass the sniff test. And that's in part because we didn't have to get these designs permitted for ADA. So we just presented designs without saying anything about ADA. And I don't know if there would ever be a situation in which we need officially for this project to be ADA. So right now, what I'm describing this is it's almost ADA, but maybe effectively and practically for our end users, who are the ones we ultimately care about, this might be sufficiently wheelchair accessible. But I think the key challenge we thought there was no way around was to have to break this 54-inch sidebar requirement in a kind of creative way. So I'll be curious if anyone has thoughts on that, but you'll see a better 3D view of that very shortly, actually pretty much right now. So that's our bathroom solution. And the tub shower still basically has the same dimensions. All right, so let's jump to going back through the whole assembly at the component level, because we did make one big change from our original conception, which was that this whole core unit, bathroom and kitchen, would be one massive object that you would roll into the garage like a car, and it would be just low enough to be under the garage header, something like 7 feet. And then we've kind of switched from that into a more component scale where it's 4 or 5 or more pieces, and they all can be picked up by 3 or 4 people. And we just felt like that would solve some of the potential challenges around conveyance of a larger object and allow them to potentially be a little bit taller than 7 feet, because you can kind of duck and then go back up. So here's an example house. I won't share the exact addresses of the residences we're working with now, but this is modeled off of one of them. And it's a very small house that has a main residence and then an existing 2-car garage. And it basically looks like this if you were to look at the garage today. It's got a water heater for the main residence. It's got a washer and dryer. It's got a step up into the main residence. It's not being used for holding vehicles at the moment. It's got a couple windows, and it's got a concrete curb around it that is a little bit thicker than the framed wall itself. So I'm going to go through a few steps in what we think a duo would look like in this project. So the first thing would be kind of retrofit and then refinishing the existing garage. This was a step I described as quote unquote preparing a blank canvas. So things that have happened here are, we might have enclosed the water heater for aesthetics or for venting purposes. We might, hook them up with a brand new, stacked washer dryer combination to give a little bit more space in a very, very scarce resource in this garage. And then on the separation wall between the garage and the main residence, remember, which by building code is required to have that fire rating and that sound rating, we've implemented that shaft wall system, which I think is about 3 or 4 inches extra thickness. And then on the other walls, they may not need to be thickened in any way, but because in this instance, and it might be true for many other garages, there was a concrete curb that was sticking out, then imagine furring is the kind of approach for these other walls. After you've added the necessary insulation, once you've done the necessary wiring inside the exterior walls, then you can apply drywall, maybe not do the final patching and painting, but have that all kind of ready to go before you've done anything that's prefab related. If you needed new windows, you would do it at that time, and you wouldn't necessarily do anything yet to the ground. So that's step one, this kind of presenting the blank canvas. In this case, we actually would need to do ceiling as well. If you've got a garage that is exposed rafters, then either the resident is okay with that or would prefer a flat ceiling, and then you deal with the appropriate venting conditions and so forth. All right. So then the next step here is one of our kind of novel, what we think are novel, but low-tech solutions, which is you need to be absolutely sure that what you build in the factory will fit in this corner and will fit in a level and flush way with exactly flush and level floor and ceiling and walls. And that may or may not be true. So what we propose doing at this stage is bringing in some kind of simple template that roughly sketches out what the dimensions of the overall module will be. You can see here that it's got an overall width to plug into that corner, but it's got these easy stands that can mock up a flat edge to a wall that eventually will be there that needs to hit correctly at the top. And if you put this level up, you'll notice if the existing garage wall is slightly sloped outwards or inwards. And those are important things to correct because that might have to be a structural connection or you'll have to deal with that at some point. So we figured that this is part of that furring step to make sure that you actually have the appropriate connection point with surfaces on the walls, on the 2 walls you'll use. But you can see on the ground that there are some holes and circular and square holes. That is related to our thinking around subfloor plumbing. So these holes you can see here are the only penetrations we imagine being necessary for a duo design, which would be a shower drain, a sink drain, and a toilet drain, and then potentially some coming back upwards for vent pipes. So before you've done anything, of course, you do need to roughly know where the lateral sewer is. But the idea here would be kind of sketch out exactly where these penetrations will be. And then you can remove this template and actually start to saw cut on the concrete. The assumption here is that the lowest cost approach to dealing with subfloor plumbing is to do a trench like this inside of the garage. It can be even easier if you go out the right side. I'm just showing an example here if you needed to head to the main in this direction. And this would allow you to preserve most of the concrete slab, and then you'll fill this back in after you've applied and added the subfloor plumbing. You circumvent this entirely if you can do a raised floor design, but at some point the sewer system needs to then get back into the ground. That might happen one time or outside in a raised floor setting. But in this version, you can see that the contractor would have identified where to cut out based on that template. But going way beyond that, they would actually pre-assemble the plumbing system. Here's an underfloor plumbing system offsite, and they can bring it in basically with this original plywood template. So I'm going to imagine this has been built offsite, and you would take this and put this right back inside. And the way it's laying here, it's got the plumbing system exactly where it needs to be. And it's also basically floating. It's being hung from a plywood connection right now into whatever trench space you had created. So you see P-trap with the shower, etc. And then this one, just imagine this is a full line all the way to connect with something else in the lateral system. So in this setting, you've identified the exact placement that the subfloor plumbing needs to be at, so that later on, when you bring the above floor walls and systems, they will be exactly where you need them to be. And again, that's also relative to exactly where the full wall would be placed. You can then fill in aggregate and do pouring as well of the concrete with the plywood there, keeping this thing exactly in place as long as you need to, and then you can kind of remove the plywood at some point. But that would allow for this subfloor plumbing to be where it needs to be. In theory, we think you could also do a pressure test on just this component. And you might want to do that right when you've brought it in, but you haven't put back in aggregate and concrete. You would plug at some lower level here, and then you would plug on these apertures and do a kind of pressure test or water test. And that would potentially be all that's necessary for the inspector to say, that plumbing system looks good, and then we'll come back to see your above floor plumbing pressure test. But it would give the contractor the confidence to then fill this up. So the next step would be to bring it to something like this. So in this version, you've got your drain and vent pipes, ready to go, ready to be received by above floor systems, but you're confident that there's no leakage from this point all the way to the connection to the lateral and to the main. All conjecture, we haven't done this yet, and we're not sure if a plywood template would be enough to deal with the threshold problems of connections. That's our current thinking, and at the very least, it might be fun to just see how well this works. So we're curious about any comments folks have specifically about this template style strategy. But then you can imagine at this point, you are pretty much ready to receive the components. You've got underfloor plumbing ready to go. You've kind of repoured concrete. You might have leveled the ground as well with a self-leveling underlayment. And now you're ready to receive pieces. So now let's look at pieces coming in. First logical one would be kind of far in the back. We're going to look at the transfer shower arrangement. So you place this object, which is 3 walls and a transfer shower already roughed in and framed. And it's got enough of a 3-foot clearance. And notice that part of what makes this specific configuration of a duo efficient is that you don't really need extra walls on the far back side of the bathroom. So that could be saving space and material as well. So this connection actually only connected into the drainage of the shower, which you would have to do anyway. So that's step one. And we think this is, something people can pick up and carry.
Some kind of restaurant, I think. Yeah.
And that can get installed first thing. So then the next object is the wall that would contain the sink and the toilet. And it's possible that those are not directly attached and are just put in at around the same time. But this is a lightweight unit that includes some above floor plumbing, specifically the sink drain connections and vent pipes. You'll notice another pipe up top here that's going to be related to the mini split system that could be kind of threaded through, or can be mostly already attached when these 2 pieces come in. And we're already kind of accounting for all of our subfloor vent piping system being connected, which might imply a possible pressure test now, or you wait until the kitchen sink has been attached as well. The next wall is the wall that is kind of the separation between the bedroom and the bathroom, with a little bit of a stub for where the kitchen counter will be. So you'll notice the door here swinging in a specific direction. This object, this square here, just references a possible sub panel, electric panel if you need it. And here's a 9,000 BTU mini split system with the outdoor condenser is going to be on the opposite side of the wall as this pipe is going out. That pipe has your refrigerant pipe as well as your condensate drain line. And then we think this is adequate for heating and cooling the existing space. All right, now let's take a look at that ADA situation. So this has clearances for the shower. It's got T-turning ability in this main space. And then the ADA bathroom requires a certain length of rear bar, and then that 54 inches of sidebar. And so what I've mocked up right now, as you can see, this is certainly hacky unless we make this look good, is a level additional, say 3 foot or 2 foot grab bar with a little bit of separation here. So that door swings outwards. You can think of this as a handle or the actual mechanism, although you should make it easy to lean on this without opening the door. And that's our attempt to get almost to the letter of the law, but at least the spirit of the law when it comes to ADA accessibility. And I guess for a homeowner who doesn't require that, then just imagine without any of these grab bars or without the one that seems to be attached to the door. So that's what our almost ADA compliant bathroom looks like. There's a tub arrangement that if folks are curious, we can look at. The tub arrangement we think is a little harder to install because it makes for a back corner that's hard to get to for structural connections. All right, we're almost at the end. I mean, as you can imagine, this design is not that complicated. So then you can bring in whichever kitchen configuration you were interested in multiple pieces. This could be obviously, fridge comes in on its own. That doesn't need to be made modular. And big pieces, either the whole L or the L and 2 pieces could be brought in, roughly put together. You've got your a flexible drain line for the sink that would make for an easy attachment under the cabinet to where the plumbing wall was. And then you've got in this case, we propose a very, very narrow electric range, microwave hood, which will have an exhaust duct as well, because this definitely is a small counter for anybody who will spend a lot of time cooking. All right. So that's what its arrangement is in the space. And then we add a ceiling, or you would do kind of filler wall, but the ceiling is going to be necessary at some scale for dealing with the lighting wiring, as well as the exhaust duct for the fume hood, for the range hood, and for a bathroom exhaust fan. So this is showing a potential rectangular duct that's just on the top of the ceiling where nobody would see it, going to an exhaust vent sideways, which we would assume is easier than going up through the roof. And other kinds of metal conduit for electrical wiring can just run at the top of this as well. If you were to have to go filler wall to an existing ceiling, then that would imply that some of this ducting and electric work needs to happen in that first blank canvas stage, as opposed to being able to happen near the end. All right. And you can see that the windows now happen to be in logical locations relative to this core layout. That seems to have been true for the 2 projects we've started to design for, but that will be an open question, because if you got a window kind of right where I'm proposing a wall going, then that makes for a challenge in this design. Okay. And last step is, once everything's been done inside, including any other interior partition walls, then there would be in 1 or 2 pieces a infill wall for the garage. And since you were dealing with potentially not a lot of windows in the existing garage, and maybe not interest in putting more windows because that might involve structural engineers, we've been able to go through curving without any structural engineering stamp in this project. Then this one, you would want to probably maximize the amount of windows you get in there. And there's an architectural question of whether you go through the effort of having the exterior finish of this infill be matching of the existing house, which is probably stucco in this area, or for practical and creative decisions, to intentionally make this finish different than the rest of the house. Anyway, the garage door as it existed in the past was obviously visible, separate from the main structure. This can preserve a bit of architectural memory that this used to be a garage, and is either something desirable or not for the resident. But since I'm imagining matching stucco paint is not something you want to do at the very end of this step if you're tired, then you go for a very specific, clean, modern separation of finish at this stage. All right. So that is the whole assembly. We can go back through different stages here and talk them through when we open the floor to questions and comments. But I think at this stage, I'll just conclude with a few more images on the slide deck. So going back to those key design challenges, what we think we've brought forth as these open source solutions that will be well documented and detailed would be a shaft wall assembly solution for fire and sound rated barriers, at least one wall for every garage ADU. For the wheelchair accessible design, I'm putting question marks here, but hopefully folks in the audience think that in the spirit of the law sense, this has been designed to be wheelchair accessible, but with an iffy door grab bar solution. For these goals for the prefab components, for them to be easy to deliver and install, I think the main choice we made was to go from a single large module, which definitely would have to be brought in by forklift, to these smaller components that people can pick up off of a trailer bed. To work for most existing garage layouts, still to be seen. That will depend on the larger market. We haven't done an exhaustive inventory of all the possible garage layouts. But we think just making this as small as possible helps in that regard. Having 4 different configurations with options for shower and kitchen gives a little bit more user flexibility. But the rest is going to be highly dependent on where existing windows are and where existing sewer connections need to go. And whether this whole venture, doing any of this in a special creative way versus just having drawings that any contractor can go and build on site, like we are claiming that this process at scale will make it faster, cheaper, easier. But that is a hypothesis until we have actual bill of receipts and actual time log from the 2 demonstration projects we're doing. So I'm personally very prepared for having gone through 2022, and I would report back to the public that this did not cost any cheaper than if we were just to do this stick build. And I'd have to admit that an attempt to show for an industrialized solution did not quite move the needle when it came to garage conversions. It may still be a useful design to put out there, but it wouldn't have actually delivered on cost. Alternatively, I might get to the end of 2022 and show that these projects were in fact, 50K or less. And then that would be hopefully pretty exciting for all of us who want to see this kind of option out there in the market. All right, last 2 design challenges here for the sewer lateral to underfloor to above floor, and how to get all those connections to happen precisely and with the appropriate inspection clearances. We think some sequence around this plywood subfloor plumbing template allows you to do what you need and build an above floor and subfloor plumbing assembly offsite and bring those in at different stages in the sequence. And then for leveling the existing concrete floor, we think that there's just self-leveling underlayment products out there that you would do right before you bring in the big modules, or right after you set the core down and kind of shim it into place, and then you level the rest of the concrete floor. On top of leveling, then you would do the kind of floating vinyl floors, I think, as a standard solution that many of us do anyway for our own homes. So that's one solution, and we are going to try that for at least one of these projects. But maybe one of our 2 demonstration projects might go for a raised floor. And you could see in the example I shared that there was a staircase. So from a wheelchair perspective, it also just makes sense to have this entire interior, if this is going to be used by one family, to be level. And so a raised floor seems to solve a lot of problems because it gets rid of the need to cut through the concrete floor, and plumbing is easier to repair in the future. That's just going to be weighed against the cost of that additional wood and any other design challenges that are brought forth by raising your floor 2 to 3 feet. So I'd be curious if folks have a prior on which is just fundamentally the better default for the Aduo project. All right. And then some quick product features just to show what we're thinking of. So ADA shower options we think would work for transfer and for tub arrangements. And we would consider this default, but as this is put out into the world, of course, anybody can use this sign, but swap out the shower for a non-ADA shower if they just didn't anticipate needing that feature. We've got a plan for connection for a 9,000 BTU capacity mini split system. Really anything I think would work these days that it's out in the market at your local Home Depot. And of course, you can put more money into better products, but we are looking for pretty much everything we use to be the stuff you can go pick up 3 blocks away at the Home Depot in East Palo Alto. Possible water heater, if you wanted an extra water heater, then we would propose it going under counter in the kitchen layout. But it could also be the case that your existing water heater has enough capacity, because this is really a very small amount of additional hot water usage in this Aduo. Because of practical kitchen design considerations, we are going to be out looking for the absolute smallest kitchen appliances that can exist. Of course, we can go fancy with induction stovetops. We're definitely not going gas with these. But it will come down to price again, and just familiarity of use for the population we're building this for. And then when it comes to junctions, we've had some experience with this with the solar decathlon house, where we had 5 big pieces that needed to have Romex disconnect and reconnects. when we were moving this house in pieces. We had even refrigerant piping connects and disconnects. So I'm familiar with products like the Romex connector you see on the left, and I'm comfortable with all the different piping and wiring connections that are implied by the Duo design. And then structural would be easy to do if you create little panels to get to all the hold downs or anchor bolts you'll need throughout the process. And then self-leveling underlayment as a possible solution on the right side. All right. I think I'll leave concluding remarks for the last minute or so before we get to 12:30. So I suspect there will be a subset of the group here that was just merely interested in seeing what has gone on, but might not have particular feedback they'd like to share. Definitely feel free at this lunch hour to sign off, and would look forward to you reaching out with any questions or comments offline. So thanks for attending if you're a part of that group. But for others who have questions or critiques or suggestions, would love to start to go through those. I see just one comment so far in Zoom, but start to feel free if you don't want to hog time orally to just drop questions and comments in the chat. But otherwise, I suggest we go with raised hands in the Zoom feature, and would love to just start hearing what folks have to share over the next 30 minutes here. And really appreciate those who are sticking around to share feedback up to this point. All right. I know Forrest, and I see you've put your video up and you put a note there. So either that or other comments you had when if you're started.
So in thinking about that, the plumbing design that you proposed, trying to figure out how to connect to the existing home's infrastructure is inherently a pain, and digging on under slab work is also a pain. And so there's a company called SaniFlow, which is saniflow.com. They make a variety of products that are intended to work for basement rehabs. And having those macerator pumps would not only capture the toilet, but the sink and the shower, and then the kitchen. And so in my mind, having one of those boxes in the cabinets under the kitchen area and then pumping up and over into the existing house would be far, A, cheaper, B, less hassle than going the concrete route. And you're shaking your head, which means you've probably heard about these. What are your thoughts, and have you considered it, and why is it crossed off the list if it is?
A little bit is honestly being unsure whether it will pass the building review. We are in the particular jurisdictions I've spent time on behalf of other ADU projects and my own. There's stuff that's clearly on the books for building code for years that an individual inspector or third-party reviewer will just say they don't do in this jurisdiction. And I didn't want to bring in that possible risk on something that maybe I'm incorrectly assuming will bring scrutiny. But that could be an incorrect assumption, and it would be worth at least having that conversation and seeing if the building officials and inspectors that are most comfortable with our work would share just what they would do if they saw a design with a SaniFlow product. I'd be curious if anyone else has already solved this problem, has permitted SaniFlow projects in San Mateo County or elsewhere in the Bay Area, to give a sense. But I tend to hear mostly about the horror stories when you get somebody on the wrong side of the bed in the morning, and then they start to compromise your whole project because I think it's a little bit too unordinary. Yeah. But otherwise, I would be curious to think through, at least to have that as a back pocket solution. If anyone has one that we can I could go take a look and try it out, that'd be really exciting as well.
Derek, I'd also be curious on the broader topic of that you just mentioned, the regulators or the enforcers or the inspectors. Given that I also have experienced this different outcomes based on what their mood is and who's the one that shows up. There needs to be, as simultaneously designing a product that's factory built, is there a way you could seek out pre-certification so you don't have to rely on these individual checks or check marks? Because I think as you've elaborated, it's a huge hindrance if one person does it and one person does not, in which case then your entire design is hinging around the person who doesn't want it. Can you basically take them out of the loop by jumping ahead of them in the food chain of regulation and say, look, we've gone through your building code department. We don't care that you don't like it, but you will inspect this and cross it off and say yes because your building code, your department has already signed off on it.
Yeah. So those who are familiar with some cities like San Jose, there's some level of quality of this kind of system where you've got this pre-approval of specific vendor products. And we are actively trying to do that in some other jurisdictions and experiencing some culture shock with that concept. I think in part, I've made that hard with this Duo design because of its kind of DIY and component nature to imagine it getting a kind of factory approval, like many other modulars and even maybe some other garage plugin kinds of solutions out there may have done. And maybe that's like a trade-off between having that very explicit pre-approval and letting this just be as good of an idea as it can be in the public good sense that people can kind of riff on. And it just makes good decisions from a design perspective that over time can be convincing to inspectors. So maybe think of this as the first attempt to kind of claim that landscape of like on a common sense basis, we can just take this to inspectors and they don't even necessarily need to think about the fact that it has prefab elements. It just is logical choices. And unfortunately, that means that maybe some exciting products you'd want to attach to this maybe are like meant to be if you want to go for it, but you've got a version of the Duo that you think is going to be non-controversial for most installations. But yeah, otherwise, I think our approach has been to try to encourage at the department level for plan check and building check and inspectors to start to build that culture of having a little bit of your discretion given away to form a precedent. And that looks like it's been successful in places like San Jose and other places. I think it is not easy to enforce from a top-down perspective and comes from kind of changing people's minds. And I have a whole separate theory of how quickly we can make that change happen in the Bay Area. But great to hear about those thoughts. Okay, would love to. Thanks, Forrest, for sharing. I see a hand up in the group from Jill Woodford. Would you like to share?
Hi, Derek. Thanks. This is really exciting to see the work you're doing. So just a little background. I work in ADU space. I've been working there for the last 2 years for architecture firms and design build firms. I have a couple comments and questions. Have you come up with a standard compliance for Title 24 and provide those instructions to each of the homeowners? Because we've had situations retrofitting older buildings where some are really easy to get to comply and some need pretty significant structural and insulation, windows being replaced and things like that. The second thing I wanted to bring up, I think it's really important, especially if you're a nonprofit and you're targeting, certain communities that are, a lot of employment is labor in these communities, to keep the employment local. And so I'm curious if you have a factory partner that's in the Bay Area. I know a lot of prefab stuff's being built in Oregon, Sacramento, Utah. It'd be really great if we had something in, a local community, whether it's Oakland or East Palo Alto. I'm wondering if you've looked at indoor materials toxicity. A lot of times cheaper building means worse for the occupants. There's a group with the NAACP right now that's focusing on housing equity in the built environment. Also Build It Green is starting to talk about this. And so I'm just curious if there's been any considerations about green technology, green materials, specifically with indoor air quality. I have a suggestion for the plumbing template. I'm not sure it's really going to save any time to have that plumbing template. I mean, it's like such a little amount of plumbing that you're actually doing. And if you did build a template, you could use something like without the plumbing assembled on. I like the idea of that. I've talked, to builders and people about doing this kind of thing where you give them a template for where all of the MEP needs to go. Maybe use ram board instead of plywood, so you're not wasting as much material for that. And then just have them do the install and the plumbing on site, because a lot of times what we think is going to happen doesn't actually happen at the time of execution. And the builders need to be really flexible and be able to work around unexpected situations. The last thing is, I've been involved with a lot of garage conversions. It's not common to build another subfloor, I think, because of cost, because it lifts it up. A lot of people want a storage space above the garage because they're losing their storage space. And so, if we can find a way to do it, reduce, not use wood where we don't have to, and like keep the cost down, I think, just cutting out that slab is probably going to be that's just what we've seen is the way to go.
Great, thanks so much. Lots of great questions and comments. Let me try to go quickly through. So for Title 24, for these, we've gone the prescriptive route, and there only seem to be two certificate of compliance forms. I think it's like Alt 05 and Alt 02 that we needed to do. One of them was specifically for the mini split unit, but this was intentionally going away from the performance-based analysis that might be required, and there's absolutely no relationship to the existing heating and cooling system. And then the insulation we're putting in, I guess, was taken for granted as a goal, and it's a combination of, for exterior walls, I think it is fairly straightforward to get to the sufficient amount, and then for that fire-rated barrier, that whole assembly has high insulation no matter what. So that we'll see if any other hiccups come along the way, but from as far as I can tell, it's already gone through one of the jurisdictions from a Title 24 perspective, and it seemed like the kind of thing where in our documentation we can provide the Title 24 forms already filled out as much as we can, and guidance on what to do for the rest, and whether you need to go hire Title 24 consultant for the final sign off. That will be on the Title 24 side. For indoor material toxicity, so I definitely am with you on, we don't want to have brought in another equity problem by designing for cost, sacrificing on energy for the environment or on health from an indoor materials perspective. I think like my concept there would be, it definitely helps to have lowered the cost floor with just good design choices. With that, don't prevent you from then coming back and swapping in materials and individual products on a as needed and as able basis. And I hope that as able is mostly driven by, at the current environment, grant resources that can be kind of tied to these projects to just make that even less of a decision barrier for households. And so I think a lot about just the landscape of nonprofits that do home weatherization and retrofits. The Gladder Heart ADU program that's been here in San Mateo County, their thinking was basically, let's put out free ADU plans so that you don't have to pay the $5,000 to $10,000 for architects and engineers, and you're reinvesting that into the green features of this ADU. And so I can certainly imagine that when this becomes just an idea out in the world, it will open the door to plenty of people who want to add more high quality, healthy materials and appliances to this. And then it'll be either available for those who would already invest in that, or coupled with grant options to make that available truly for everybody. Local labor, so that is very inherent to our concept. We would want to be able to encourage local workforce. So I can imagine that just looking like contractors who get more into this business when there's more, potentially significantly more demand for this kind of low cost option. For manufacturers, and also for designers, I think the idea is just that if the client is interested in this, then an architect, maybe the hardest person to convince is the architect who doesn't want to use a standard design like this, but it would just be out there as something easy to incorporate into, still, of course, site drawings you have to create no matter what. For the manufacturer side, I think our opinion there is if you are already a local factory builder and you have the space, why not build this as well as whatever else you want to build in a proprietary sense? And again, hopefully that's just driven by market forces if this truly is successful. But I think what's otherwise exciting is that this might be the right scale for more like training programs where you've got job train, there's a couple other ones we've talked to where we've just seen that there's, things that are built and then like demolished after you're bringing through carpenters and plumbers and so forth. And could you actually build the average job training program, workforce development program into a kind of social enterprise that can actually make revenue as well by selling, the really easy pieces you can see in here and just, abide by a certain template. And that could be interesting. Maybe it's not big enough scale for that to ever take off. But I think that this kind of concept opens the door to that connection to that industry that I'm interested in. Ram board, totally agree. And for subfloor, it's great to hear that just from your experience that there is this potential greater use of just the pure storage of a loft assembly. And for this particular house that this one is modeled after, there already was a loft space in the garage, and we'll probably keep that either above the ceiling space or on half of this area. So that's great to hear. Thanks, Joe. Okay, on the chat, I see a comment from Jackie about pre-approval on a county-wide level. Be curious if you have any other elaboration, but my experience on this has been trying to help the Heart Gladder program get to something like pre-approval for their 4 designs that were done by a San Francisco architecture firm in just a handful of cities. And that has seemed like a pretty difficult process where no city has been willing to go to the level that San Jose has gone with the level of pre-approval. So I'm not sure what county-wide here means. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Derek, hi, I'm Jackie Young. I am the planning director with the town of Woodside.
Oh, great.
And we have a group called 21 Elements,
Mhm.
which is the 20 cities and the county. And it's a planning group that works collaboratively. However, there's also a group of the building officials that's the same thing. So
Yep.
my thought was if you could, kind of infiltrate one of those groups
Mhm.
and come up with, with some basic agreements, it may help with cutting down on the amount of outreach you need to do to individual cities. Just a suggestion. I realize that different jurisdictions have different quirks. For instance, I was thinking 2/3 of our town is on septic, for example.
Mhm.
But it may help cut down, and we really need to get these units produced and out. So yes, I would.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I,
Yeah,
I
thanks,
would.
Jackie.
I would love to talk with you more about this because I would be interested in helping you with that.
Great. So thanks for that. I think I have been at past 21 Elements meetings, those planning meetings as well, just because some of that kind of broader work that I presented at the start has engaged with the 21 Elements process on ADUs and on other planning subjects. So I definitely thought of at some point once this is ready, especially when we can tell the story of those 2 demonstration projects,
Right.
that I would want to do the circuit and talk to as many of those convenings as possible.
You could also be doing these workshops at the city, and they could be advertised on the next doors for next door, Woodside, next door, Redwood City, whatever.
Mhm.
Or we send out townwide postcards, we send out newsletters. So the easier we can make this for people, the greater probability we're going to have for success. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. It's fantastic to hear about all the systems you're looking at and all the ways that you're trying to make it easier. So thank you for your efforts, Derek.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing. Okay, I see a hand up from Ann White.
Hi, Derek. Ann Wyatt. I'm director at Smart Share Housing Solutions in San Luis Obispo. And I want to thank you and affirm your sort of intent and assumptions here. They're along the same lines of efforts we've been undertaking at a local level on the Central Coast. And really working along very much the same assumption as far as necessity for price point and potential for the prefab components and making use of the garage space, even to the opportunity for workforce training at the local level, kind of doing some of this. Also want to affirm the challenges, as other speakers and commenters have pointed out, in the sort of pre-permitting process. We've tried to work with our planning departments and get some of that, but we see challenges with every garage being a little different and not a lot of inclination to go there. And so I'll really be very curious to see how it comes out. The level of detail and kind of point you're at, it all seems plausible and like the right directions to be going. So thanks for the efforts.
Thanks, and I'll be curious to learn more if the workforce training concept you described is underway, because I would love to just understand programmatically how to make that the most successful.
Well, I'll be wondering that too as we piece it together. So we'll report back. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I see one comment that came in the Zoom chat about lofts being considered double FAR, and Joe mentioned it depends on jurisdiction. I think that one way to think about this is that the average 2-car garage is something like 400 square feet. So you're still under the JADU maximum size of 500 square feet if you were to bring in that loft space on a quarter of your area. And then if you were designing this as an attached ADU, you might have a little bit more leeway because the size of that is dictated by 50% of the existing house or 800 square feet. All right, Forrest, you wanted to jump back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add some experience to floor leveling compound. It is not as great of a product as it says or intends to be. And so I don't think I would strongly hesitate to rely on it to quote unquote fix a garage floor, and instead, with regards to the concept of ensuring walls are vertical and floors are level, all of your components should instead have the capability of being shimmed or adjusted or trimmed to where they are then appear to be level or flush and whatnot, because you're never going to get the right angles that you're shooting for, even in new construction.
For sure. Yeah. So I think there's an amount of that for wall-to-wall corner connections. That is the baseboard and the molding is the solution. When it was just going to be a kind of superficial sense of unlevel. Does that imply for us that if, let's say, the average concrete garage floor has a 1/8 to 1/4 inch per foot slope, that you would imagine that from a user perspective, you might just like live in that space with that amount of slope that was never corrected for at the full floor plan level?
Yeah, that's the way I would view it, in terms of the hassle of trying to make a level floor. And you can position things like beds or and you can make countertops level by trimming the cabinetry in and of itself. And so the human perception of that slight variation of 1/8 per foot, I think, is going to be minimal compared to the effort to provide it in a grand scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. So certainly, yeah, at the component level, you can ensure level. My main question was from a user perspective, whether there would be the demand for truly level floor. And I mean, I think my office right now is more of a slope than that. So at least personally, I wouldn't go for that extra effort. And maybe we haven't quite broached that question with these homeowners yet on whether they want to see that happen. But it looks like a few folks, including Nick, are feeling roughly the same way about that, as not a requirement per se when it comes to this framework. Nick, did you have any other suggestions, or do you just agree that that should just not be taken as a requirement in a typical garage conversion?
No other particular comments. I just think that I also am in agreement that furring up the floor would likely kind of present other challenges. Some garages might not have the height to accommodate that. And once you start figuring in the slope necessary for the subfloor plumbing, you might run into, a height issue with the floor. You might have to fur it up 6 or 7 inches by the time you get to your finished floor. So that might also make that option unrealistic in at least some situations. So I kind of agree with likely leaving the floor itself alone and kind of building everything else around it.
Great, thanks. I'm curious if anyone has noticed a major blind spot of something that will make this kind of garage conversion, even what I shared, much more complicated, much more expensive. There's just something we haven't shown modeled. I guess I didn't specifically describe a couple things like, outdoor wall mounted condenser unit for the mini split system. And there will be at least the vent pipe exhaust to deal with. But it might be hard to think of in this context. But if anyone kind of had in mind that we're just missing a step in this process that will happen, more than 50% of the time, would love to hear.
Ventilation, aside from exhaust, you need supply air, especially if you've got a gas burning water heater that needs venting. Yes, this is probably not the most airtight assembly to start with, but I don't know if through Title 24 you'll have to adjust your or even provide makeup air. And in my mind, that front facade that fills in the garage would be the appropriate place for a pre-added, pre-wired ventilation solution.
Yeah, so we didn't encounter a requirement at the Title 24 level beyond just the, I think it was more the building code requirement for a certain amount of natural ventilation that's possible through your existing attic and just your ability to have operable windows, and I guess a certain applied infiltration rate to your existing space. I guess, yeah, because we're going with a non-air-based system, yeah, especially if there's something that's like $200 that works well in a wall, then that would be a no-brainer to just include by default. But I guess that will relate to a slightly separate question of air quality in the Bay Area. And maybe that's another way to think about like how do you go from the basic to a more health conscious version. And that would be a solution that can try to be a wall embedded ventilation and filtering system. I don't know if there are good products that are designed like that, or the market is mostly about just having HEPA filters that are embedded into vents or your countertop kind of air filtration solution. But maybe there's something that can be easy to embed into a wall here. Okay, I see 2 comments in the chat here. Vapor barrier for existing slab and footings required by the building code. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that, but what we've done in the past garage conversion is at that concrete level, you do a kind of, you apply a coating. I think the particular product we have used in the past was like directly suggested by the East Palo Alto building official. I think it's called Vapor Tight, and some like weird color thing you paint, right before you apply the underlayment. The underlayment for the floor itself might also have that water barrier property. But that seemed like it was fairly straightforward. Not sure about toxicity. Might need to look back into that. Okay, and then you also added a wheelchair accessible kitchen option too, for sure. Yeah. So I guess none of these models have specifically shown that, because in conversations with the homeowners, that specific ask hasn't come up yet. But I guess if they were interested in that potentially for the bathroom, it's worth kind of keeping that conversation going around lower counter kitchens as well. And again, in a world in which the basic concept here is really just how A plugs into B and plugs into C, that kitchen is ripe for any amount of manufacturers and vendors out there to suggest other products with other features that can plug and play. Stuart, you shared a blind spot here. More about lifestyle here. So you bring up hip housing, which is a non-design concept that involves sharing living space. These 2 cases have been, the mom is already living in the house, is starting to think about aging in place, wants a space of her own. And so this is about not really changing living dynamics, but then just allowing for a less crowded situation. What's a little bit implied in these situations is that you are still sharing that washer dryer, but you can imagine a version of this design if you were to rent this out. That the washer and dryer for the main house moves inside, and then there would be a washer dryer that can be attached as an additional flange, kind of roughly where you see the mini split is, would be a logical place to still drop a washer dryer setup, or somewhere attached to the right side of the kitchen counter, and then that would allow for not having to share for clothes washing. But otherwise, I do think garages are in this interesting gray area of maybe 50-50 in terms of whether they're truly for renting or for renting out to families. I've seen some surveys that suggests that it's at least much higher likelihood than if you had a detached ADU. So it's potentially there for a situation in which you're not fundamentally changing the living dynamic and hopefully improving it as a result. Let me go back to my last slides here, just because I think we're getting close to the end here. So in general, if you want to engage more for any purpose, there's just an easy interest form on the adilo.org site. And I think at this stage, we are still looking for a contractor to do this work. We have a potential factory space that would just give us the ability to work indoors for the prefab components. But this first version will be built by our contractor offsite and then brought onsite. But if you just have contractors who might want to do that work or would be good to continue to brainstorm with, I would love to make to be introduced. I came across a slightly separate but related policy question, and some of you I interact with in Casita Coalition and other kinds of settings, so we would talk about this in other settings. But I was surprised when I had attempted to apply for these being JADUs, because in my own mind I had assumed that a garage conversion would become a JADU, and at least one jurisdiction came back like giving comments of the nature where they had assumed that this was an attached ADU. And a homeowner has also expressed a lot of hesitation around the deed restriction owner occupancy requirements for junior ADUs. And that kind of got me realizing, wait, why did I assume that garages have to be JADUs? And what exactly is the benefit of calling this a JADU if you could call it an attached ADU? And I think I've reached the conclusion at this point that as long as a jurisdiction is interpreting state law as a garage conversion being able to be considered an attached ADU, then on the designer and client supporter side, we should never encourage a JADU designation, because that would just add strings attached. And an attached ADU designation would be the cleaner solution here. So I'm just curious if anyone, this was like obvious to everyone else, but I had spent a good 3 years assuming that garages were JADUs. So I'd be curious if anyone has any reactions to that. And then the other thing I just wanted to float, if folks were wondering, is that it seems like another big barrier for the cost. It has nothing to do with the ADU. It has to do with sanitary districts who are taking this as an opportunity to require a full replacement of a sewer lateral. And I think that's in a situation in which a sanitary district has no other way to trigger that unless there was a plumbing related change happening in the house. So we just have this problem of lots of older homes in a place like East Palo Alto are overdue in all senses, practically, for a sewer repair. And now that's getting bundled with doing what was supposed to be a low cost ADU project. That's looking like at least 10K for one or both of our projects right now. And there's other kinds of strange oddities around how sanitary districts are interpreting state law or not interpreting it intentionally. So that just seems like, it's a problem at the systems level to have to have the bottleneck of the ADU bring in this other big, costly, but probably really important repair. And just be curious if folks just agree and commiserate that that's a big problem we can't really avoid, or we can think more strategically at a system scale, policy scale on how to encourage sewer laterals in a way that doesn't hit the pocketbook as much. Okay. I see, Anne, you shared a comment around JADU designation. Yeah, so I think well, imagine this, if we're dealing with properties that don't already have a detached ADU, and this was the first ADU they wanted to do, then in that situation, I would imagine that it makes sense to do that as an attached ADU first. And then if you wanted to do a third ADU, then it would have been required to be a detached ADU, no matter what. So I would be curious when I talk to planners whether it would be okay to take an attached ADU and redesignate it as a JADU if then the homeowner wanted to do it detached in the future. But that gives the greatest flexibility for the cases in which folks just wanted to be able to use their garage for this purpose and don't want that key owner occupancy string attached. Yeah, but I guess that will just come down to whether a local assessor, whether a planning department's okay with that. Okay. I think that is it. I had just a few other potential images here. This is just showing, and this will be the kind of stuff that shows up in the full open source documentation in the future. These are just what the two ADUO projects look like that are going through permitting right now. And you'll notice that they're just mirrors of each other, but we're both actually the I-shaped kitchen option. And then we've got some standard garage curb details that we've been using for a while, and I think came from Milpitas originally. So these will make their way for sure into the open source solution. And then here's that concept of that front elevation becoming distinctive architecturally from the rest for practical and for specific aesthetic reasons. Yeah. So with that, unless there are any last questions or comments, of course, we can keep the conversation lines open offline, but really thankful to have had this big group willing to stick around and be interested and excited. I didn't hear any crazy criticisms, but maybe you were saving that for later. You just think this will crash and burn as a concept. Well, definitely, I'll let you guys know in about a year whether it has crashed and burned, and you'll see lots of YouTube channel videos and photos of the process. So looking forward to what it can do in the bigger ADU sphere, and would love to stay engaged with as many of you as possible on this journey. We will, Fernanda, what do you think? HLC maybe will have a standard way to host the recording, and then I'll just potentially incorporate pieces of it into stuff we're putting out as city systems. Again, if I actually want to use any of your voices and anything, I'll definitely let you know if I thought that it was an interesting comment to incorporate. But otherwise, this has been super helpful to hear all this feedback, and looks like there will be connections to make moving forward. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody.